Welcome to my documentary on the Korean War, a war that would change the world and decide the fate of the Korean Peninsula, a war that would forever define the rest of the Cold War, and how it was fought. Today we are going to talk about all the phases of the war, what led to the conflict, and the ultimate conclusion for the conflict as a whole. Before the Koreas were even split, the country was ridden with strife. The peninsula was under the control of the Japanese, who invaded Korea and China well before World War I. Near the end of the war in the Pacific, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria and northern Korea. Combine this with the US's atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese realized the futility of the war and thus surrendered to prevent any more bloodshed. Both countries were brutal dictatorships who ruled through terror and fear. Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee were both bloodthirsty and both had ambitions towards a united Korea by any means necessary. However, Syngman Rhee had a disadvantage. He was extremely unpopular with the people, and he was seen as a Western puppet due to his lack of military experience and the fact that he lived in the United States before becoming ruler of South Korea. Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung had military experience and fought in the Korean resistance. Syngman Rhee's military resources were extremely limited due to budget cuts in the U.S., reducing the amount of aid the U.S. was willing to give him. All the meanwhile, well-trained Southern Communist guerrillas were ravaging his country and raiding his supplies, forcing him to redirect resources to his police and security forces. That meant that the Republic of Korea's army was understaffed, undertrained, under-equipped. All the while, the North Koreans were getting aid from the Soviet Union in better quantities and qualities. Tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft were all given to the North Koreans for very little. Combined with communist Korean veterans from China who were fighting the Japanese in China, returned to North Korea, providing much-needed combat experience for the North Korean army, making said army one of the most powerful armies in the Korean peninsula. After securing his position within North Korea, Kim Il-sung focused his attention on the South. After seeing the weakness of the South Koreans, Kim Il-sung asked in 1949 to be allowed to invade the South. Although Stalin was extremely hesitant, for he feared an escalation in the conflict could lead to a world war. But finally, in June 25 of 1950, the Soviets gave Kim and his army the go-ahead to attack South Korea. A mechanized offensive by the North Koreans captured Seoul in 3 days. However, the army failed to capture Syngman Rhee and his cabinet, due to the South Koreans managing to retreat and hold the Han River, buying precious time for the U.S. to get involved and for Syngman Rhee to clean up house. He intensified the purges of communist sympathizers before retreating to deny the communist followers in Korea. President Truman was also extremely hesitant to defend South Korea, due to it being a dictatorship and not wanting to be the president to start World War III. However, due to his fear of communist aggression and the domino effect, he established a policy of containment to contain communism that was rising in any country by any means necessary. Truman knew that getting the U.S. involved alone would be seen very badly internationally. To show it was a multinational effort and not the U.S. beating down another country, he managed to get UN support in the Security Council for an intervention in Korea, even though that the Soviet Union could have blocked it with a veto. However, the Soviet Union was boycotting the meetings due to Communist China not being represented in the Security Council. Instead, the Security Council was staffed with non-communist Chinese under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek and the Taiwanese state of the Republic of China. Although finally getting the go-ahead to help South Korea, the US and UN forces were still in the back foot. Lacking anti-tank supplies and being severely outnumbered, the United States and UN forces staged a fighting retreat to Busan with the North Koreans hot in pursuit. However, when the retreat finally ended and the U.S. finally stopping in the Busan perimeter. The North Koreans were exhausted, and their supply lines were stretched out and vulnerable to airstrikes, which the US did. The North Koreans were finally vulnerable. And after a failed offensive in Busan that resulted in the destruction of the North Korean forces, the UN forces are finally ready to commence their counterattack. MacArthur and other US generals were extremely worried that the North Koreans could win the war of attrition due to the North Koreans' superior numbers. US generals therefore devised a plan to and an amphibious assault behind enemy lines to cut off supplies, reinforcements, and cut off the enemy retreat. Wanting a location near Seoul, MacArthur and other US generals decided on Incheon, a port city near Seoul. Although plagued with tide problems, naval mines, and shallow water, the landings began on September the 24th, with the 1st Marine Division landed in Incheon. Although the Incheon landings were a success, the fight for Seoul was extremely bloody and involved house-to-house fighting. But Seoul was finally captured by UN forces on September 25, with President Syngman Rhee re-establishing government there. Confident that the North Koreans lost the will to fight, UN troops under General MacArthur advanced to North Korean territory. Betting on the fact that the Chinese would not intervene, the UN, urged by the US, changed the goal of the war from a defensive standpoint to an offensive war to liberate the North Koreans from communist tyranny. Fearing a US-backed unified Korean peninsula, the Chinese began preparing for an offensive. With assurances from the Soviet Union that they would provide air defenses and anti-aircraft guns, the Chinese prepared for an offensive. The Chinese first offensive began on October the 25 under the leadership of General Peng Duhai. And although merely a probing attack to gauge UN troop effectiveness, this gave the Chinese the know-how on how to kill UN divisions. These tactics boiled down to 5 steps. First, attack at night. Second, cut off the troops from the rest of the army. Third, push any reinforcements that try to aid the beleaguered defenders. And finally, use the terrain to gain an advantage against the US troops. This, coupled with other offensives, forced the US to retreat. Peng Duhai's most successful operation, however, came in the Second Chinese Offensive, when Peng Duhai told his commanders to look weak and goad the US and their puppet troops to lead their defensive positions and attack into the ambushes set up by the Chinese. MacArthur, seeing the weakened Chinese positions, attacked and fell for the trap, almost surrounding the US Army, although managing to escape due to the initiative of General Walton Walker, who defied MacArthur's plans to leave exclaves of American troops in Korea, but instead retreated his army. This act may have saved the 8th Army, but the damage was already done. By the time of the third offensive, the Chinese captured Seoul for the North Koreans. After multiple failed attempts by MacArthur to attack the Chinese, and being tired of his independence and its insubordination, President Truman officially relieved MacArthur of all positions within the army in April of 1951. With the addition of fresh new blood in the form of UN reinforcements and a new, more competent leader at the head of the army in Korea named Matthew Ridgway, the US and UN troops managed to stalemate the Chinese once more. However, Mao Zedong was growing more and more impatient with General Peng, especially when General Peng said that his troops no longer had the initiative and can no longer attack. As punishment, Mao Zedong forced him to commit the Chinese army to an offensive to crush the United States once and for all. Although, due to Matthew Ridgway's tactical acumen and the use of artillery and well-fortified defensive positions, coupled with the fact that the Chinese army was exhausted, the Chinese were repulsed in their 5th and final offensive. And finally, after a counteroffensive by UN troops, Korea was at a stalemate. Seeing Korea as a stalemate, Mao's advisors wanted a negotiated peace, especially Peng. However, Mao wanted a united Korea under communist rule, so was willing to go out in an all-out war of attrition to get an advantage in the peace talks. However, by sheer chance, on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died, and within weeks, leaders of the Soviet Union voted that the war in Korea should be ended. Mao Zedong received the news with dismay, but he knew that the army in China could not continue without Soviet assistance. Therefore, in July of 27th, the armistice agreement was signed, and on July 27th, the Korean War had officially gone into a state of truce, with the current front line being occupied by the DMZ.